Okay, so
self-presentation as well.
Oh yeah, like the song, my name is Luca. Luca Caldironi, I am a psychoanalyst of the Italian Society of Psychoanalysis and the American Society of Psychoanalysis International. I am also very interested in art. This is why in the city in which I am based most of the time, I also open two places like art galleries in which I try to combine, to put together my two skills. I'm very glad to be here with you and also to have the possibility to have the experience of a different point of views. And in this, the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, the statement helps me when Heraclitus says, changing alone is unchanging. So probably we are here together with different possibilities and to put together this. And also in this moment, also we are all a little tired. But let me start and introduce a very good friend of mine, Professor Lois Oppenheim. Lois Oppenheim is a university distinguished scholar, professor of French literature, and chair of the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Montclair State University in New York City, where she also teaches medical humanities. Professor Oppenheim is a scholar associate member of the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, where she is also on the faculty and honorary member of the Psychoanalytic Society of the William Alanson White Institute. She has authored or edited 15 books, including Imagination from Fantasy to Delusion, which was awarded the Courage to Dream Prize from the American Psychoanalytic Association, and the co-authored For Want of Ambiguity, Order and Chaos in Art, Psychoanalysis and Neuroscience. Other titles include Psychoanalysis and the Artistic Endeavor, A Curious Intimacy, Art and Neuropsychoanalysis, and the patent word Samuel Beckett's Dialogue with Art. In addition, Dr. Oppenheim has published over 10 books, chapters, and articles, and this, well, 100, sorry. I lost 10, but 0 does not exist, no, so it's not a problem. So, now I want to say 1,000, of book chapters and articles, and is co-creator of 2 documentary films on mental health. So please, Lois.
Eat or be eaten is how the physiologist H.W. Smith explains survival, the homeostatic reality in accordance with which mammals maintain the neurochemical equilibrium, the internal balance, which by way of feeling keeps us alive. Homeostasis is explained in accordance with the free energy principle, the theory that our innate tendency to disorder or entropy is reduced by the accuracy of sensorial prediction and the consequent minimization of surprise. This theory, as developed by Carl Friston from the second law of thermodynamics, stems from the hypothesis proposed by the 18th century English statistician and clergyman Thomas Bayes. Known as the Bayes theorem, the hypothesis states how the brain, in continuous struggle against surprise for the purpose of maintaining homeostatic equilibrium, prevails. And Friston's free energy principle is increasingly the premise upon which neuroscience, with psychiatry and psychoanalysis not far behind, is based. Unlike those in neuroscience who claim that a concept of a given feeling must precede the experience of that feeling, those who subscribe to what Lisa Feldman Barrett calls the theory of constructed emotion, a theory based on the coming together of social, psychological, and neuroconstructions to create categories of emotional response that are learned, Mark Solms and others invested in neuropsychoanalysis attest to the innate origin of affect. Rather than constructing categories of affective states by way of conceptual knowledge about emotion, they view feeling, which implicates a conscious awareness of it, as stemming from the responsiveness of brain circuits to experiential triggers. I'm not hungry unless I know I'm hungry. But what has all this to do with aesthetics, and more precisely with body image? What I would argue, were there time, is that there is a misconstruing on the aesthetic front of the consequences of revising Freud, which is to say a misconstruing on the aesthetic front of the consequences of reconceiving of meta-psychology as a meta-neuropsychology, and a misconstruing on the aesthetic front of the consequences of grounding neuropsychoanalysis in Friston's predictive coding. In the interest of time, I will devote my discussion in what follows to the second of these, with body image serving to support my argument. Neuroaesthetics initially gained prominence by research in the 1990s and early 2000s into the visual workings of the brain. Whether having to do with the creation of the artwork or its viewing, it was the ocular circuitry and neural anatomy of the brain that informed understanding of the making and reception of visual art. In a 2011 publication, Tomohiro Ishizu and Semir Zeki moved beyond consideration of the purely visual components to distinguishing between art and beauty, and to proposing aesthetic experience not only in terms of the activation of particular brain regions, but of a subjective definition of aesthetic experience, expanding their brain-based theory of beauty, as they called it, toward a broader explanation of aesthetics. They raised the question of the connection between, on the one hand, activity in the specific region of the brain on which their study was focused, the medial orbitofrontal cortex, and on the other, reward. 2 years following this publication, a study appeared offering a radically different explanation of the origin in which the pleasure of aesthetic experience was said to reside. The authors of that publication, Vittorio Gallesi among them, claimed that the perception and action are not separate domains implemented in different anatomical and functional circuits, unquote, that perception does not precede action, but that action itself contributes to perception. Although adhering to the principal notion of neuroaesthetics, that the activation of the visual cortex of the beholder is a crucial aspect of visual art perception, they articulated their belief in the irreducibility of the aesthetically experienced visual image to either, quote, a cortical visual process or to a higher order cognitive process. And in accordance with the results of the study that investigated cortical motor responses to paintings by the abstract expressionist Franz Klein, they made the case for the cortical motor system activation during observation. The conclusion reached, in other words, supported the notion of sensory motor arousal stimulated by such viewings, stimulated by the viewing of such art. It supported, as articulated by the authors, the hypothesis postulating the role of embedded simulation of the artist's gestures in the perception of her works of art, grounded on the activation of the physiological mirror system, mirror mechanism, instantiated by cortical premotor areas. In the context of embodied simulation, the mind, itself embodied, partakes not only of the intersubjective, but in intercorporeal exchange. Contrary to Gallesi and others, however, Solms, for one, attributes embodied simulation to mechanisms considerably more reflective than compassionate, the former occurring automatically via mirror neurons, the latter acquired as opposed to innate, and best considered a feat of development. While not denying the existence of embodied simulation, Solms situates the this mirroring mechanism, on another level of function, one not truly empathic in the accurate, if complex, sense of the term, and outside the aesthetic domain. Artworks are actually as dead as doornails, Solms proclaims. It is possible to misperceive the state of another mind in ways that do not arise with, say, the appreciation of a landscape. Who is to say whether or not a willow is weeping? Unlike the work of others, whose painting is abstract in the sense of a transformation of the actual to the indeterminate, the painting of the celebrated French artist Geneviève Haas may be said to reveal looking itself. If Haas's art is pleasure-filled, it is precisely that there is a feeling of invigoration that emanates from desire, from curiosity, from the vastness of what she called her blue, from wanting to grasp hold of the undefined and learn from it. As in the most highly abstract paintings, those, say, of Agnes Martin or Mark Rothko, it is the synchrony of color, form, and texture that pleases the viewer as well as the creator, the viewer as co-creator, and without any hint of resemblance whatsoever to the recognizable. Indeed, lacking recognizable shape, depth, and more, true abstraction is precisely that, what is removed from the known, from the identifiable. There are those, however, whose research in neuroaesthetics has led to the conclusion that such art is more anxiety-provoking than pleasure-inducing. There are those who claim such art to be less pleasing, owing not only to a lack of the detectable, but the predictable. Does Carl Friston's free energy principle, his substantiation of the theory of predictive coding that shields us from surprise, from uncertainty, from chaos, and indeed from homeostatic crisis, implicate a need for free energy minimization in the aesthetic experience? Does Friston's law, as Soames calls it, implicate pleasure and displeasure in accordance with predictive coding? Does it implicate a potential for equilibration and its opposite, owing to prediction accuracy and error in the domain of creativity? Is one to conceptualize some sort of homeostatic dysregulation beyond the physiological in the context of the imaginative? Increasing uncertainty is bad, decreasing uncertainty is good, as Soames often reminds us when referring to biological imperatives, the governing factors of the mind-body's maintenance of well-being. In fact, he goes so far as to claim that consciousness itself is definable as felt uncertainty, insofar as need implicates awareness of need, which is to say the feeling of need, and it is feeling which governs the reduction we seek. As he also says, however, given my definition of consciousness as felt uncertainty, it is interesting to note the role of surprisal in aesthetic experience. Indeed, surprisal has everything to do with aesthetic experience, insofar as learning and memory, the neurological supports of expectation, are continually disrupted by errors in expectation, whether in literature or visual art, music, or other performance art, leading to the conclusion of some that felt uncertainty reigns. Minimizing error in prediction is a persistent primary goal in the everyday lives of all human beings, a goal attained through either of two means, a change in expectation or a change in action. In what is termed by theorists of predictive coding, an alteration of the predicted sensory inputs or active inference. Why then might artists yield to the disorder of prediction error in making or responding to art? Why might artists, as the painter Robert Pepperell has asked, cultivate a resistance to prediction error minimization in themselves, in their art, in others? Consider art in which no image is displayed. Agnes Martin, now this of course is form, not image. Agnes Martin often claimed that art has its source in inspiration, by which she meant in the revelations that came to her when she closed herself off to the world, when solitude provided the means for her to open herself to the reverie-like activity, not unlike that of free association, such as it occurs in the consulting room. This is the place, she would say, the internal space in which form yields to formlessness, the stasis of imaging to the activity of imagining. Her paintings, she claimed, revealed a world without interruption, and therein lay for Martin the notion of beauty. But inspiration for Martin was not only about submission, about having to turn the little picture she had in her mind into a 6-foot canvas. It was also about the universality of certain kinds of experience that was unencumbered by personal feelings or cognitive intrusions. Martin wanted to draw from the viewer, as she described it, that quality of response from people when they leave themselves behind. The absence of image is how she aimed to achieve it. What she aimed for in her work was what she referred to as merging, formlessness, once again, a world without objects, without interruption. Martin wrote, "As it was in the beginning, there was no division and no separation. Try to remember before you were born." This is reminiscent of oceanic feeling, about which Freud learned from the writer Romain. Its limitlessness or bond with the universe, its early phase of ego feeling. The pleasure of Martin's work emanates not from the representation, the representation of the external, but the localization, the defensive protection even, of the pre-representational. The work of Louise Bourgeois, however dissimilar and however much focused on body imagery, is also a case in point. While the images she created, in whatever the medium, reveal much suffering, they also reveal, as art critic Donald Cuspit has said, a mental unstableness having to do with her difficulty in getting a firm grasp on her body, a persistent and infantile emphasis on part objects as opposed to a coherent whole. Psychoanalyst Britt Marie Schiller, referencing Thomas Ogden's notion of the sensory-dominated, primitive position he calls autistic contiguous, has described Spiral Woman as a suspended, spinning female figure whose entire body, but for the legs, is trapped in coils of bronze, twisting in the air. The coils wrap around the woman, with the spiral embodying the sensory enclosure of the autistic contiguous mode, almost like a second skin wrapped tightly around her body, as hard and shell-like as an autistic object. Consider once again the non-representational color field paintings of Rothko, where the sublime precludes the symbolic. I would cite in this regard a paper by Sean Gallagher titled The Unaffordable and the Sublime. Gallagher writes of the sublime as an overwhelming of the imagination in a way that one connects with the paintings of Rothko, Martin, and others. Perhaps the most important thing to be said about the sublime, Gallagher has written, is what we cannot say. The notion of the sublime includes the idea that it is something that cannot be represented. Whether represented, suggested, or entirely visually absent, the body is as fundamental to the abstract expressionist as it is to the thematic creativity of an artist such as Louise Bourgeois. Transcended in the sublime, enveloped in the wholeness of the oceanic, or defended against in the pre-symbolic, bodily perception and its consequent body image give rise to what has been termed by art historian Valerie Hellstein a felt sense of space. When Freud wrote of the egos being first and foremost a body ego, he was suggesting not only that one's sense of self evolves from the awareness of one's corporeal distinction from mother, the giver of life, but from the feeling to which sensation and perception give rise. A person's own body, and above all its surface, is a place from which both external and internal perceptions may spring, Freud wrote in The Ego and the Id. And it is precisely the projection of this embodiment, the embodiment of these perceptions, that is revealed in the visual content of the post-1940 paintings of Willem de Kooning, in the visual movement constituting the drawings of David Smith, in the radiant color of Rothko's art. Moreover, as Hellstein noted, the materiality of the surface of the painting itself contributes to the impact of this projection. It is not just that de Kooning was painting sexually explicit, erotic images of women, but also that the surfaces of his paintings feel a certain way. The surface of women singing is slick and creamy. One can feel the twisting of the figures because of the slickness of the paint and the way they feel in their shallow space. This kind of resonance has, of course, been admirably discussed by Gallese, who has demonstrated that one feels one's way into the art to experience the multiple dimensions at play. But, my goodness, but then there is this. The idea that on the basis of prior experience, as Van de Kries and Wagemans, Sander van de Kries and Johan Wagemans have written, quote, the brain actively makes predictions about what visual input to expect in the current context of stimulation. And prediction errors are the mismatches between these predictions and the current input or incoming evidence. Connecting prediction with emotion on the basis of the founding of predictive coding on homeostasis and the vital maintenance functions of the body, they argue that to understand aesthetic emotion, they must make this link explicit. Focusing primarily on, quote, perceptual features of art and only briefly touching upon content, which can, of course, induce a whole range of emotions, quote, the authors write of the so-called obstacles that visual artists repeatedly and deliberately create, unquote. Why, they ask? Their answer, simply put, is that the resulting prediction errors are not necessarily negatively experienced. Their answer is that, quote, negative affect, discrepancy, and disruption are important components in aesthetic appreciation, insofar as there is progression from a state of more unpredictability to a state of less uncertainty, unquote, and therein the pleasure of the artwork is said to lie. Though their work and that of others working in this arena is rich and informative, it leads to 4 problematic conclusions. And here you will notice is where I differ dramatically from our next speaker. And it was in a meeting where we both were actively disagreeing with one another that this discussion came into being. Okay. So there are 4 problematic conclusions. The first is that the paintings which most impress us are those, quote, in which we can, with some labor, distinguish recognizable, predictable forms, unquote. Is recognition, however, really a prerequisite for the maximum appreciation of art? Ladislav Kessner is another who has elegantly incorporated into the neurocognitive frame of prediction the psychological and subjective dimensions associated with it and accounted for cultural implications relative to aesthetic experience. He too defines the appeal of the prediction coding account, incontestable in the behavioral context, which he situates in the context of furthering empirical studies of images and perceptions and the psychological understanding of art and its history. It is important to note that Kessner acknowledges the dynamic and temporally unrestricted nature of the encounter of the beholder with the artwork. It is important to note that he recognizes how the prediction coding account serves as a scientific support of certain philosophical elucidations of aesthetic experience, such as the hermeneutic studies of philosophers like Hans-Georg Gadamer, which is to say that he stresses the potential for greater interdisciplinary dialogue, if not the compatibility of the predictive coding perspective with other explanatory frameworks. It is significant, in other words, that he stops short of situating the minimization of uncertainty, of unpredictability at the antipodes of the ontology of art. Yet Kessner as well writes of the resistance and aversion to contemporaneous art that have been constant features of the development of modern art since its inception. He too pursues cognitive components inherent within a supposed repugnance, an antipathy he relates to cultural determinants and an inability to identify objects in visual images. And this, once again, is where, to my way of thinking, things go terribly wrong. While the claim of aversion is historically accurate, though I would venture that it was not as widespread and historically long-standing as Kessner claims, identification, knowing in this way what one is viewing, is by no means prerequisite to aesthetic pleasure. Rather, I would argue, it is the very drive to know, sensorially or cerebrally, which is to say, in curiosity itself, in engaging proactively with uncertainty, in Jaak Panksepp's emotional drive system known as seeking, and the imaginative activity, the creativity it impels, that pleasure is to be found. A second conclusion has similarly arisen from the predictive processing theory. From the learning-based perspective of predictive coding, Van de Kries and his co-authors deduce that frequent engagement with a piece of art or music detracts from its emotionality, suggesting that we are often chasing an experience we cannot fully relive when revisiting the same artwork. This is a stunning supposition, especially for the ease with which it may be experientially refuted. Once again, it may be important to recognize the value of memory and learning, the value of predictive processing in the appreciation of art. A third problematic conclusion arises, however, when the interrelation between the epistemology and ontology of art are substantially diminished, if not entirely ignored. A problem arises, in other words, when subjective experience is discounted. To cite Mark Rothko, a painting is not a picture of an experience, it is an experience. Just as a theatrical performance is not a representation, but an actuality. A painting, like a poem or novel, is not about something, it is that something itself, as Samuel Beckett claimed with reference to the writing of James Joyce. And to the extent that art is deemed embedded in the conceptual accounts of some in neuroscience, like Feldman Barrett's Picasso principle, which views creativity as a skill, a learnable skill, it loses existential and thereby ontological ground. Among others who have contributed significantly to our neuroaesthetics, to our understanding of the neural correlates of the appreciation of art, is Edward Vessel. Regarding as integral to aesthetic experience the default mode network, that region of the brain activated introspectively when at rest, Vessel and his co-authors have proposed that certain artworks have greater appeal owing to the relevance of the work to the viewer's, reader's, or listener's sense of self. Like the conclusions noted previously, the idea that the most appreciated of artworks are those in which there resides a resonance with the sense of self appears to me problematic. Maurice Merleau-Ponty famously wrote, quote, "It is by lending his body to the world that the artist changes the world into paintings," unquote. The philosopher is not far from Freud's recognition of the bodily surface as a place from which both external and internal perceptions may spring. Not far from Freud's idea that it is through the body, psychophysiologically speaking, through the mental projection of its surface that the ego arises. For Freud, the id is the body as subject, the primary subject of consciousness, whereas the bodily self is an idea, a learnt representation of the self. If the conclusions noted previously, and this one, the idea that the most appreciated of artworks are those in which there resides a resonance with the sense of self, appear problematic, it is owing to the fundamental question that subtends it, namely, the meaning of intersubjectivity if there is no subject in the work of art. Questioning the meaning of intersubjectivity in the absence of a subject, in art not real, as Solms has said, is to pose a question seemingly so concrete as to be worthy only of being dismissed. But a problem does arise when the interrelation between the curiosity involved in the making and viewing of art, the interrelation between the epistemophilic drive stimulating the creativity of any artist or engaged viewer and the ontology of art is disregarded. A problem does arise when subjectivity in aesthetic experience is ignored. Ambiguity need not be reduced for uncertainty or the anticipation of its reduction to produce pleasure, insofar as curiosity, fascination, is in itself pleasurable, and I would add, not merely pleasurable, but often exhilarating. In agreement with a statement made by the British painter Bridget Riley, namely that, quote, perception constitutes our awareness of what it is to be human, indeed what it is to be alive, Robert Pepperell reasons that if, quote, being is what it is to feel alive, and hardly, okay, sorry, I'll jump to the end here, and highly salient prediction errors are marked by heightened state of awareness, then maximizing these errors within certain bounds can effectively heighten one's sense of existence. Jumping the remaining, just see if I have a slide that would, so just to sum up here, Samuel Beckett made two very astute comments, in my opinion. I will skip the final part of this presentation and just simply say that in concluding my dispute with those who, in their application of the free energy principle to art, deduce above all else that the pleasure of art resides in recognition, I am reminded of two statements by Samuel Beckett. The first is that being is constantly putting form in danger. It is this that is projected in the most abstract of paintings. The second is the danger is in the neatness of identifications, which is not showing. There we go. And this is the argument I am putting forth today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry to go so fast. And I love the quote by Samuel Beckett, that being is constantly putting form in danger. I think it's very evocative, and we need time, of course, to go deeper in this topic. Very briefly, I just want to say a few words for the second presenter, Francesco Castellet Ballarà.
Very few, thanks.
Yeah, okay. Very, you have to, not 1,000 chapters, okay? Medical doctor, neurologist, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, is a full member of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society as the International Psychoanalytic Association. Co-founder and secretary of the Italian Psychoanalytic Dialogues, building bridges between psychoanalysis and neurosciences, European Space Agency consultant, psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, psychiatrist and consultant of UMENA, the European Organization of the Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites, faculty of member second level in Neuroaesthetics, University Tor Vergata, Roma. He is author of several papers on neuropsychoanalysis with a peculiar focus on predictive processing model of the mind. Prego, Francesco.
So my presentation will be apparently very close to those of Vittorio Gallese, I'm sorry. And I don't know what about the arguing with, with Lois. In my opinion, our relationships are quite close, or could be close, we'll see. Anyway, the title of the presentation is Aesthetic Experience, so close to Vittorio, according to the predictive processing model of the mind. Okay. So the aesthetic experience, this is a quotation from, let's say, the group that works with the coding. In fact, it's Freestone, the last author. And the heart aims to produce an intense emotional experience. An aesthetic experience actually grabs you instead of it being about something you grab, because you need it. It is about being moved or touched, instead of being the mover of the word. Interestingly, this implies a receptivity, a readiness to adapt, but also something that is still beyond your receptivity, beyond what you can currently comprehend. In a minimal sense, there is an aesthetic dimension in every experience, all the stronger the more we, ourselves, and our mental models of the world are moved instead of being the engine. This also implies that aesthetics is fundamentally a restructuring of our mind. That is a learning, a type of learning, although not an intellectual type of learning, but an emotional type. At its core, beauty is a feeling. Eastern philosophy and languages like Chinese do not conceive beauty as a noun, but only as a multiple, different adjectives related to an object, a situation, and so forth. the aesthetic experience is a process rather than instant appreciation. It is an interaction between subject and object with its own temporal dynamic. It has contradictory, even paradoxical elements. It evokes positive and negative emotions, harmony, disharmony, order, and change. Individual differences in the appreciation of a work of art are ubiquitous. The contribution of the beholder's share determines what one finds appreciable or incomprehensible. The aesthetic experience is ephemeral and unrepeatable, even an individual observer. It is necessary to distinguish, then, between defining something as aesthetically appreciable and fully living the aesthetic experience at that moment. It's not the same. In fact, when we look at a painting, for example, we see an artifact that seems to be vividly present in the world, composed of detailed shapes, texture, and colors, and depicting imaginary or real object. But according to the predictive processing model, what we see is not what it is in the world, and not even what is given by our sensory data, which are necessarily confused and ambiguous. Rather, what we see is created by the brain that hierarchically generates probabilistic prediction of the most probable causes of the sensory data, since the brain does not have direct access to those causes. As some predictive coding theorists claim, what we really perceive are brain-based hypotheses or inferences about what's in the world, using our current sensory data and the knowledge derived from our previous experience. That means memories. So-called reality, between brackets, is actually a control hallucination, this set. And the cultural group we belong to is actually the controller. And is open to the relationship between the individual and the group. Okay, maybe I can switch this, but just to summarize the PP theory, the real point is that the sensory data, what is coming from the sensory data is actually the prediction error, as also Louise was stressing. That means that there is a mismatch between the model we have and the feedback we receive from the world. And art, in this sense, art perception, is biologically and culturally determined. This introduced the cultural hyperpriors, according to Kressner, in which prediction at the lower level of the cortical hierarchy are under the control of evolutionary selected, more abstract and fundamental expectations, sometimes called over-hypothesis or hyperpriors. For example, of an over-hypothesis or hyperpriors could be the attachment drive of the baby with the mother. This may be innate and biologically hardwired. However, some high-level priors are formed and transmitted through participation in culture, in material and symbolic system. A likely candidate for the central and public cultural prior that operates in art perception is a general pictorial competence and the capacity of seeing in us, as to say the ability of the human observer, that's typical of our species, to see a certain object in a depictive configuration on a pictorial surface, to see through the depiction to its referent. As interpretation of prehistoric archaeological finds suggest, this capacity is the result of a long evolutionary process that started at the latest around 100,000 years before present, but probably much earlier. There is also an ontogenetic component to this capacity, as it has been demonstrated that pictorial competence is partly acquired de novo in human infants. So also a sort of general to put together what we have already heard and seen from the other presenter, we could think of art as an active, bodily-based interpretative process shaped by interoceptive awareness, predictive processes and embodies the responses. For example, empirical and cognitive robotic studies have shown the importance not only of sensory-based prediction that do not demand action per se, but also of active engagement and moving in the world as a means to develop generative models and specific forms of understanding within them. We move from our inception, and it is possible that grounding concrete and even abstract concept requires action and action prediction in the spirit of active sensing and learning. It is by moving and actively reproducing the shape, colors, sound of an object through art that we acquire representation of affordances, space, object, scene, and the sense of self and agency. In living organisms, these and other circuits support a core sensory-motor understanding of reality, an embodied intelligence that grounds our knowledge and words models, thus providing a foundation for conceptual and abstract thoughts. And art, of course, has a role in emotional regulation, because art emotional impact arises from its ability to mediate between predictability and novelty, fostering a dynamic interaction with the viewer or listener's predictive mechanism. Visual art, music, and literature often encapsulate themes and patterns that balance familiarity with innovation. Is the famous Goldilocks effects in neurodevelopment, enabling the brain to reconcile new sensory input with prior expectation, thereby reducing the free energy. But the art has also a big role in evolution of cultural communication. For example, early human art forms, such as synchronized dances and rhythmic sounds, were likely non-material and emerged under evolutionary pressure to unify groups during survival critical situations. Visual art, dating back over 100,000 years, likely evolved as a communication signal, complementing language and enabling the representation of abstract ideas, thus enhancing social bonding and cultural transmission. Music and other forms of art also play roles in niche construction and gene-culture co-evolution, contributing to the development of shared norms and group identities. These communicative art forms extend the human cognition beyond individual minds into shared cultural environments, facilitating a feedback loop between genetic evolution and cultural innovation. So we could say that art as transmission, knowledge, or updating prediction models or narratives has to be told by a storyteller or an artist, because he, the actor, is able to add the right emotions at the proper time of the script, for example. Is able, in short, to embody the narrative of the prediction model. Embodied narratives build synchronicity, attunement among the members of a cultural groups, and no synchronization is possible without emotional interoceptive alignment. Very close to the conclusion. So, in my opinion, this role of art about social community gives strength to something already the Greeks have underlined, and the concept of the beautiful and the good as a definition of a beautiful object or a beautiful person in this sense. So the evolutive importance of art making and experiencing would be to train a flexibility in the social modeling of the internal and external worlds versus non-adaptive and rigid stance. And this, let's say, an example in modern times in which there is the famous 62.2 million banana, and from Catalan, in which we say the title of the opera is "On what basis does an object acquire value in the art system?" Comedian fits neatly into the strand of relational art, an art form born and developed in the 90s that see the work of art as a tool for confrontation, discussion, debate, and relationship. Relational artists like Maurizio Cattelan are wont to shift the audience's attention to the context rather than the object itself. And comedian works exactly like this. He creates a space for discussion, controversy, and reflections that invest, in his case, not only the relatively narrow art system, but the entire public sphere. And this is the guy who paid for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you for. Yeah, we have only 5 minutes, so 10 minutes. And also I'm very curious because after Laura's presentation, speaking about ontologic psychoanalysis, I'm a clinician, so I'm very interested to go deeper in with this topic. And I know that probably there are several questions from the presenters. Yes, you.
Just a quick question or two for Francesco. Just to get to the very bottom of all this, do you, as an individual, believe that recognition and sense-making, as they call it, is essential to pleasure in the work, in viewing the work of art?
If I get it, it's about perceptual awareness.
About,
what do you mean?
About understanding is the word that Kessner uses, and recognition is the word that Van der Kries and others use. Do you believe that some sort of understanding?
No, I do not agree, if I understood well your point, because for me the central point is affect and emotions. So understanding for me is too close to conceptual level of dealing with an object.
But so responding emotionally does not depend on any kind of cognitive understanding or recognition of something in the work of art, and liking less abstract art because
in work of art, in my opinion, there is a situation in which actually your cognitive level should shut down in a way. And you have to go back also, as Freestone said, without a proper predictive model of what you have on view, you have to go back into a very low perceptual level, which you have to palpate the new object. So you are open to new. You are looking for a new model, because the old models is not working at all. It's a kind of mystery you are confronting with. That's my opinion about aesthetic feeling.
Okay, thank you.
So it's like a mystery. So what I'm thinking now is also in the different, in Italian and in English, when you say understanding, in Italian comprendere, so when I think about to understand, I cut the verb, I say I understand. So probably, if I think in the English way, I am much more closer with your idea, to stay under and to give the possibility to develop something. It's completely different than in Italian comprendere. It's like to my arm in this way. So it's like I'm thinking, it's like to have like a different language of my body. Yes, please, as a not only questions, but many comments. Yes, yes.
Hello. Hello. Tizen Sagerman from Berlin in Germany. I wanted to speak to the first speaker. Less of a question and more of a remark, but before I wanted to say that I could understand you perfectly in your pace as well as your punctuation, and I found it a bit rude to interrupt you that often. But apart from that, I want to say, because you made very early in your presentation, you were saying about abstract art and most people finding it disturbing, reminded me of a quote from a Mexican artist that's got somewhat more famous in the last years, which is art should be disturbing to the comfortable and comforting to the disturbed. So that was something I was very much thinking of, that if somebody is disturbed by a purple and a brown rectangle, that should say a lot about the comfortableness of their lives. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. No, I agree with that. It was wonderful what he said.
Well, exactly. Art is about provoking intense feelings, intense emotions. So going beyond what you already know or what do you expect. For example, the picture about the body artist is, in a way, we can think about the Holocaust, if you want, because there was the star, no, the Jewish star. But it's creeped into the body with the blood coming out. So it's something that really eats you, in my opinion, in the stomach, not in my brain. No? At this level. And then you have to start thinking about words or memories or whatever in order to have a shape of what we are seeing or the feelings you felt. That's about, no? Surprise in this sense. But surprise, according to Freestone theory, has to do with the fact that your model of the world is not confirmed of what we are seeing. So we have to find another solution. So you have to explore reality more. But reality is an hallucination. Eh? So you see, it's complicated, but in my way, in my opinion, it's open up incredibly view of the world. For example, in this sense, narrative, as Vittorio will say, could be defined as a set of prediction, complex one. A narrative is a story about something, right? It's also something that is related to the past, because we could quote memories or events on the past, but it's for the present, because it's something that I need for the world I'm inhabiting. But it's also in preparation for the future. So, complicated. But now it's just for art. Art for me is about transforming our mind. I go to an exhibition in order to be surprised, if you can say. I want to be surprised. And actually, that's also the point, art needs to be continuously renovated. Once I've seen the Gioconda, once, twice, 4 times, I cannot stand it anymore, in a way. I need something new. Maybe my reading of course, of the Gioconda could be very shallow, let's say. Nonetheless, you see what I mean? So it's promoting our mind. It's about growing. It's about changing.
So you really think that there is less pleasure in an aesthetic experience that has taken place previously, once, twice, 3 times? The 10th time you go see that same painting is not going to be exhilarating
no,
for you?
it was just an example. There are other
But that's
examples.
a big example.
No, listen to me. The point is about the reaction you have inside.
Yes.
For example, if you're not acculturated enough about a certain kind of arts, you can just disregard them from the start, right? If you have been into an introduction by, let's say, a master, they could teach you how to see the object in the right way. So it's complex, it's not so... And for example, of course, piece of art that continues to be arousing ideas, interest and pleasure, if you want, of course, are what we call the masterpieces. They continue to be so for ages, actually. But we need new piece of art. I need to go to the modern art exhibition because I'm looking for something that is related to the present days for me.
So that means you can't appreciate art, you can't take pleasure in art that came from the 16th century?
Of course I can, but it's different. It's different. I will say, as I quoted, maybe no, it was not in the... For example, the work of Louise Bourgeois, she described them also as a form of maintaining his equilibrium from a psychological point of view. There is a quotation that is quite famous about this.
Yes.
And this is a part of the art that is about self-healing for the artist and for the viewer.
Yes.
And there is another piece of art, or another understanding of artworks that is related to the group, to the transforming models of the world that the group has. So 2 parts. They are not in conflict.
I think that is so important, and that also probably you have the common ground. The common ground, in my opinion, now is like the epistemophilic drive, the desire of knowledge for both. And I completely agree with the colleague who spoke before about the power of art when art is always alive. So, and we want to be democristiano in Italy, we say, that I agree with everybody. But, you know, Francesco, when you say that you need new art, and Lois, a little provocative, say, yes, but when you see the same masterpiece, you can have new emotions, of course. And of course, so it is always new emotions is something new. Also, when you see something that you already know, and probably this is also in our psychoanalysis, no, Francesco, and starting from Freud, when Freud speaks about sublimation, but with art, and after Seagal speaks about the recovery, and Winnicott speaks about the transitional space, and what I'm very interested now is about Bion, when Bion speaks about the catastrophic changing. The catastrophic changing is the way in which the container can have the power to contain something that is growing and is going through. I think the last question, the last supper. Okay.
Elena.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Elena Marko. I'm from Moscow, a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I just wanted to comment on the last remarks because I think it's very interesting. What gives us surprise in the perception of art, and do we always need something new? Because I started thinking about our writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and about myself reading novels at different stages of my development, right? So when I was a teenager, then when I grew up a little bit, and so I gained new experience, and I was different. And my perception was transformed, and I found it astonishingly new what I was reading in the novels, right? So it was, as I was transformed, I projected something else and I perceived something else. So, and it was brand new for me, though the same novel, right? For example, Crime and Punishment. So that's, thank you.
I just want to recommend to go to the Modern Art Museum here and see Futurismo, which is so interesting because it starts in the 1900s, and you see the lions, the black lions there, which reminded me of something else that happened in Israel. Just lions there, black lions in front. And you go through this beautiful marble floor, and there the lions are. And then you see in the 19th century, which, I mean, I know and I recognize, but I remember the Impressionists and the audience, they didn't understand what they see. So the brain changed, and now when we watch these pictures, we understand it. We don't need time to understand it. So it means our brain changed. So it is a different context and a different era, and you can see there at 1910 that they somehow kind of predicted there's going to be a war. And the eyes of all the women there changing as the war changed. So it is, of course, kind of the context and the feelings and the experiences, and go and watch it. It's amazing.
Let him speak, that guy. No, not me, him. The gentleman over there has something.
Can I just say one thing? I totally agree with Elena Markova about Russian literature, and I would like to remind the American Lessons by Italo Calvino. He speaks about literature, but it's absolutely the same for any piece of art. And so there are classical pieces, and every time you see them, or every time you read Dostoevsky, you understand something new. And then there is something which is not classical, which is linked to the period, to the social situation, to the contemporaneity, and then they lose interest with time.
But Vittorio Galeazzi is sitting there shaking his head, I want. Would you?
Why do you want to drag
I want to
me
know.
out?
I want to know so that I can disagree with
Okay,
you.
it's better not to know. I've been told that we should come to a close because the translators.
Oh, no.
They're tired. Let's put it in that way. I have two things to say. I always been skeptical of theory of everything, and I think that predictive processing specifically qualifies as a theory of everything. First point. But if there is one domain where I think the psychological, bodily, you name it, you have it, evidence fly in the face of predictive processing is aesthetic experience, for many of the reasons that have been brought up today in many different talks. So I find strange that predictive processing is used to maintain the point that we watch art to be surprised. Then what are we supposed to predict? Is art is the major driving force of art is to lead us to uncharted territories. I want to be surprised. I want to discover something new about myself I didn't know before reading The Idiot or beholding Guercino or Annibale Carracci or Rothko or whatever. So I really don't see the relationship, even less I see the relationship between predictive processing, minimizing energy consumption. We spend a lot of energy thinking about the unimaginable. This is what drove us, for bad or good, until where we are. We constantly think about something that is not available. We constantly project ourselves into uncharted territories, and it's really hard to me to understand how this can be reconciled with predictive processing. I conclude by, I saw somewhere the quote of consciousness as control hallucination. I think it's part of a book of Anil Seth. I checked the reference list of that book. He never mentioned Hippolyte Taine. Hippolyte Taine wrote exactly the same definition in the late 19th century. I was surprised.
Thank you very much to everybody. We can close. Let's finish. I know.
There was one other, that gentleman right there had one more. Yes.
Okay.
People can.
This is the last question.
Very short. I just wanted to point out that I heard many Greek words tonight, which doesn't make it easy to understand what you are talking about. And I would like to point out that in ancient Greek, the word art was unknown. For them, they had techne. Yeah.
Thank you. It's done. Okay. It's done. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, presenters. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for. It's time for our aperitivo.